pray with me and for me, please. Dear God, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be pleasing unto you, O Lord, our Redeemer. Empty me of all of me and fill me with all of you, so that it's your word and your word alone that comes through this day. In Jesus' name, amen. So here at Dryman's Chapel for the last several weeks, we have been talking about what it means to be in prophetic ministry. And we've been looking at the prophetic ministries of Elijah and Elisha. And this is the last week that we'll be talking about these two men before we go to look at a couple of other prophets. We're going to be looking at Hosea and Amos over the next 4 or 5 weeks after this. So today is the last one on Elisha. And the story the lectionary picked out for all the stories, there's a ton of stories about Elisha. You've got to read them. They're fascinating. And you can find them in 2 Kings between about the 2nd chapter and the 10th chapter. Just tons of stories about all the things Elisha did. But we get this story today. So far, we know that as a prophetic people with a prophetic ministry, that we serve God. And we serve God because God shows up. We know that in prophetic ministry, we have to go out of our doors. And we have to go to where the needs are, to where the people are. It's not just confined into these walls. We know that in prophetic ministry, we speak up for those who are oppressed. We speak up for justice and mercy in this world. We know that in prophetic ministry that we need to prepare our young people to continue the ministry, so that it's a cycle of ministry that we go through. And today we are going to see another aspect, or a few other aspects of prophetic ministries. We look at this story of the healing of Naaman. Now, it would be really easy to read through this story and say, oh, that's a nice story. Naaman had leprosy, he got healed. Everybody was happy, the end, right? And it would be real easy just to read right over it and not really catch some of the things that are really kind of important in there that are kind of shocking, actually. See, what you have to understand, who is Naaman? Naaman is this mighty warrior for the king of Aram. And he has defeated the Israelites. Now, who are the Israelites? They're the children of God. They're God's chosen people. They're the inside crowd. But this story is about someone on the outside. It's about the enemy. It's about Naaman, who has defeated Israel. He is the enemy. Keep that in your head. He is the enemy. Yet the Bible tells us in this passage of Scripture that he has defeated Israel because God led him to do that. Well, what you have to understand about Israel theology, the theology of the Israelites, is that they believed that there's no way in the world anyone could defeat them, the children of God, unless it was God's will. And so they ascribe everything that happens, they ascribe to God. And so for them, if they got defeated, it was their fault and it was God's punishment on them. That's the way their minds worked. And so God to them was in this. So it was important for them to tell this story. It was also important for Jesus to tell this story. I think when we find a story in the Old Testament that we then find Jesus referring to in the New Testament, we better pay really close attention to it. And in Luke chapter 4, I believe it is, Jesus mentions this story, along with the story of Elijah going to the widow of Zarephath. And it's all caught up in where Jesus says a prophet is not accepted in his hometown by the insiders. And so sometimes it's necessary to go to the outsiders. And what he says about this story is that there are thousands of lepers in Israel, yet it was an outsider that Elisha healed. So keep that in your head this morning. Now here's the other bizarre thing, is this young servant girl. Now we could read right past that and not catch the brevity of this. So let me paint it for you a little bit this morning. This is a girl who was kidnapped and held hostage and made to be a slave in Naaman's household. She was an Israelite. She was a spoil of war. Now let me ask you, if you have been kidnapped by someone, you're being held against your will, you've been taken from your family, you're having to do all of this work for nothing, and you see your master is sick, how likely is it that you're going to try to help him feel better? I don't think it's in our nature to do that. I think we would, in our nature, wish ill harm on those folks. But this servant girl remembers Elisha in her hometown, the prophet of God, and she says to Naaman's wife, you know, if your husband would go to Israel and see the prophet there, he would heal him of his leprosy. In spite of what these people have done to this girl, she still reaches out and shares the message of God's love, the power of God's love through this prophet. She's still, in her circumstances, in her dire circumstances, she is giving testimony to the good news of God. So that's the second thing that I want to point out. So what happens is Naaman goes to his king and he says, look, my servant says there's this prophet in Israel that can heal my leprosy. And so the king says, well, by all means, go. But the king doesn't send him to the prophet, he sends him to the king of Israel. And you have to understand, this is a time of peace, but your enemy is coming into your territory. So that's why all these gifts that were read about, all this gold and all of that, is because they had to come in good faith, coming into enemy territory to protect him and to keep him safe. And he comes to the king with this letter that says, I'm sending Naaman to you to heal him. And the king of Israel freaks out. I mean, what if somebody showed up at your doorstep and said, you know, I'm sending, Harold, what if you sent Lainey to me? And she showed up at my doorstep and said, Dad sent me over here for you to heal me. I mean, I would freak out. Like, am I going to send her? I'm not going to be able to heal her. That's what the king says. The king says, I can't heal him. Who am I? Only God has control over matters of life and death. So the king at least recognizes God's power and God's control over life and death. And he tears his clothes, which is a sign of deep, deep mourning. And he says, you know, this king has sent this man to me knowing that I can't do this. I don't have the power to do this. He's not going to be healed, and that's going to be a cause for war. They're just trying to pick a fight with me. And he is really upset. And Elisha hears of it. He sends a messenger and he says, why are you so upset? Have you forgotten? Have you forgotten where the power comes from? Have you forgotten where the healing comes from? Have you forgotten who shows up? It's God. Send him to me. I will make sure that he knows there is a God and that the only God is the God of Israel. And so Naaman goes. And he shows up at Elisha's door. And Elisha doesn't come to the door. He sends his messenger at the door with a message that says, go dip yourself in the Jordan 7 times and you will be clean. Well, Naaman, this mighty warrior, is like, I was not good enough for him to come himself. You know, he was expecting this big show, right? He was expecting for Elisha to come out himself and to proclaim him healed and to do some kind of magic through his hands. And it was something as simple as going and dipping himself in the Jordan. Do we sometimes try to make it too hard? He's trying to make it too hard. All he has to do is follow the directions. That's all he has to do. And he gets mad. He storms off, and his servants say, wait a minute. If he had told you to do something really hard, like if he had told you to stand on your head and put your hand up behind, and reach your foot and do all this kind of stuff, you would have gladly done it, because you would have thought, why not do this simple thing? What have you got to lose, Naaman? And so he does. He goes and he puts himself in the water and he cleanses himself in the water. And God, through that water, just like through the water of our baptisms, cleansed him and made him whole. restored him to the skin of a young boy even. Made him better than he was before. And it was just as simple as following the directions. And then Naaman goes back to Elisha in verse 15, which was not part of the lectionary reading, but I think it's important to include it. Because he goes back to Elisha and he says, I have been made clean. There is no other God but the God of Israel. See, I think what this tells us is sometimes, many times, oftentimes, maybe all the time, people have to experience the grace of God before they confess belief in God. And that's okay. Because we, as good Wesleyan Methodists, know that we have prevenient grace that goes before us. Where God's knocking on the door, standing on the porch. And when we experience that knock, finally, we're able to say, there is no God but the God of Israel. So I think there are several things that we have to remember as prophetic ministers here in this community. And the very first thing that I want you to remember is who Naaman was and who the servant girl was. They were enemies. He was on the outside. Yet the servant girl proclaimed God's grace and goodness to her enemy. As prophetic ministers, we are called to reach out to all who are in our circle of influence. Even those who may be enslaving us, kidnapping us, holding us hostage, doing things we don't like. We're still called to breathe the word and good news of God into those lives. The other thing is, the king forgot about God. He thought he was going to have to do this on his own. How often do we forget that God is standing there with us, in our presence all the time, and we try to do it on our own, and we feel like tearing our clothes and pulling our hair out because we cannot do it on our own. But friends, you have God. You don't have to do any of it on your own. And like Naaman, many times we try to make it harder than it is. We try to think there's all these hoops we have to jump through, all these T's we have to cross, all these I's we have to dot, that we have to do everything just right and just perfect. All we have to do is follow the simple instructions. And those instructions are love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, all your soul, and your neighbor as yourself. Love God, love neighbor, and by all means, love and take care of yourself.